Today on the podcast, guys, I'm going to be talking about James Baldwin's Another Country. So if that's a book you're interested in, hang around and listen to a novel review. Hello and welcome to the Literature Podcast, A Novel Review. My name is Seamus, your host, and together we will discuss, dissect, and explore the wonderful world of literature. And the wonderful world of literature is a vast and dense jungle. So let's start making our way through, one book at a time. Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of A Novel Review, a book podcast. My name is Seamus, I am the host, and if this is your first time joining me, thank you so much for joining. If this is not your first time joining me and you're a return customer, thank you so much for coming back. I really appreciate it. And yeah, today on the podcast, I'm going to be talking about James Baldwin's novel, Another Country. But before I get into that, I always take a moment to reflect on any mantelpiece moments, something to highlight from the week past. And this last week, I went to the theatre to see what I am pretty sure is my first ever musical. It was a show called, I was about to say Normal People, but that's the book by Sally Rooney. Next to Normal, it was called, and it was really cool, really interesting. Like I said, I'm pretty sure it's my first musical, so I didn't quite know what to expect in terms of that. And it was this show about a bipolar woman sort of existing and trying to exist within the confines of her family. She's a mother, there's a daughter and a husband, and there is, I guess this is a little bit of a spoiler, there is a son that has tragically passed away, but because she is bipolar, she keeps imagining him in her, he's a figment of her imagination basically throughout the play. And so it's all about that, the complexity of, loving a son that has passed away when you've actually got a daughter that's alive and well and really craving some love and attention herself. But it was really fun because there's a lot of singing. I mean, the whole thing is singing, and I was sort of interested how it was going to go, being an incredibly dark story mixed in with music. And there were a lot, and I mean a lot, of people in tears in this. And it's a very well-revered show. One of the singers, I have no idea about theatre, but he seemed to, my friend told me who I went with, told me that he had won, I'm assuming it's the equivalent of an Oscar for a particular song, and he performed it very well. Huge round of applause when he finished that song. But yeah, the music was really sort of upbeat, and it really contrasted this really dark story of bipolar, and I found that really fun. Some brilliant lines in there. One of my favorite lines was, I need to take a chance before chance takes me. Thought that was really clever. Really simple, but really beautiful line, and it was just a really fun experience, really different experience. Like I said, I've never really seen a musical before, so I always wonder how it's sort of going to tell a story through music, and how, I mean, it must just be such a constant struggle of trying to get the song to rhyme while also making the song enjoyable, while also telling the story that you're trying to tell. So yeah, fantastic experience. Next to Normal. Apparently it's a very well-known play, or a well-known musical, I should say. So that was really good. Had a great amount of fun. My friends that I was with, one of them really loves her theatre, and she's actually directing her own show. So it was great to go with her because she just knows everything about theatre, unlike me, who has no idea about anything theatre really. And she was great, and she recommended it. And I mean, you should trust your friends' recommendations when they know everything about theatre and you know nothing. So I went to Next Normal. It was absolutely fantastic, and that was my mantelpiece moment. Bit of housekeeping, if you would like to like and subscribe, that would be fantastic. If you could hit 5 stars, that would be fantastic. If you could click the duck in the corner, if you're on YouTube, that would be fantastic. But as always, free show, so please just have a good time, listen, and yeah, enjoy the show. Okay, getting into now the main reason for this episode, the book of the episode, Another Country by James Baldwin. This was an interesting one. I have quite a few comments on it, a lot positive, some negative. First, I should say, I really love James Baldwin. If you've never read any James Baldwin, I genuinely would thoroughly recommend it. I think he's going to be up there in one of my favorite writers of all time, because he can turn a sentence. He is absolutely fantastic. He is such a master with the pen. He is an incredible writer. The depths he manages to elucidate from characters, from society, the attention of detail he has towards society, towards the individual's interaction with society, so society's interaction with the individual. He's an incredibly clear writer, I guess I'd say. He's an incredibly well thought out writer. He knows what he's talking about. He just penetrates these characters, and then that sort of penetrates you as the reader because you're having such a great time reading it. The story is told in third person, but you're also very acutely aware of the individual characters' emotions and thoughts and all this stuff. So it's really it feels really personal, and it's really personal to all the characters in the book because everyone sort of gets a bit of screen time. And yeah, I mean, if you've never read James Baldwin, this is your sign to read some James Baldwin because he is absolutely fantastic. I wouldn't start with this one. I'd probably start with Giovanni's Room, which I think is still my favorite. But I should do a brief overview, and it's actually a very incredibly difficult overview to do because it's not that there isn't a storyline, but there's no real, I guess, direction of story. Primarily, well, not even primarily, it opens talking about a character called Rufus Scott, who is a jazz drummer, and he's sort of having a bit of a tough time. He is a black man living in America. I believe it was the 50s. So he's living in New York, and he's sort of struggling with a few different things, and it's touched upon throughout the entire book. His sexuality, his race, his gender, everything that's sort of going on, his class status as well. That's all being explored, but it's about his sort of downfall. And I'm going to say this is a bit of a spoiler, but I don't think it is that much of a spoiler because it happens relatively early in the novel. He commits suicide, and then the rest of the novel is kind of his friends surrounding him, just in a way just getting on with their lives, but also reacting to his suicide, his death, and then sort of what happens from there. So there's not really a general storyline in terms of like beginning, middle, end. It's just kind of like a snapshot of these characters' lives. So that is a very, very dodgy overview. First thing first, I listened to this book, which I think was a big aspect to the thoughts I'm about to have towards this book. The narrator was incredibly fantastic. He was such a beautiful reader of the story that he actually, sometimes when you're reading, you can just read it quite quickly and not really slow down at any particular moment. You just kind of read the lines with like a steady pace, which I think is pretty fair enough. But this voice actor, I didn't actually write his name down, which I probably should have, but he really thoughtfully narrated this story. He really did a fantastic job to a point that I would say it was a fault in the story because this story is relatively long, especially for a James Baldwin novel. And James Baldwin novels are heavy stories. They're heavy reads. They are, they're not slogs in that it's difficult, but they are a difficult story to read in that they are exploring some pretty dark things. So you don't want to spend hours and hours and hours in this story, which because of this person's narration style, he was reading it incredibly slow, incredibly thoughtfully, and that obviously slowed down the reading process. And I believe that the audiobook was like 18 hours or something. And when you consider it's like a 350 page book, I think that's quite a long time to spend in a story that's not too long. So it was absolutely fantastic to listen to it, but then it sort of felt like it was just dragging on a bit. And I think that was just because it was narrated. But then on the other hand, it was narrated so beautifully that it was kind of like you're in sort of two minds about that. So it's a really interesting story because you open with Rufus. And I'm going to say the first few hours of the narration, and it must be 80 to 100 pages into the book, it is absolutely fantastic. It is brutally beautiful. The opening sort of scene to this story, the first third of this story is just so rich and so good. And it's surrounding Rufus and as he sort of sweeps through life. And it was incredible. And it's interesting because you're following Rufus really closely. In fact, he's sort of the only character that you're really following in this opening section of the book. So you can sort of tell that he's really troubled in a few different ways and he's really struggling with a lot of different things. And you can sort of see it building to something a shade darker, i.e. his suicide. But I was quite surprised how early it came in the story because it does come, I believe it's at the end of the first third of the book and then you've still got 2/3 of the book to go. And I'm going to say that removed me from the book a bit because one, I really enjoyed Rufus as a character. I thought in the opening stages of this book, he was incredibly fleshed out. It was interesting to sort of follow him as a character and I had a great time doing it. And then sort of getting to his death. And because this was a few hours into the book and it's about 100 pages into the book, I kind of thought that, like, I don't know if I would have ended the story there, but I thought that's what I had thought when the story was going to sort of start wrapping up. I thought the story, as soon as I started reading it, I thought we're heading towards Rufus's death at some stage, and that's when the story's going to start to wrap up. But it actually happened so early in this novel that I was like, oh, what's the rest of the story going to be about? And I think that was something that really took me from the story, was that it then goes on for another 2/3. And while fleshing out the other characters was incredibly interesting, they felt almost like completely different stories. And in fact, they really are different stories. At one stage, we're in Paris following another character, Eric, who is a past lover of Rufus. So there is like a personal tie there and a personal connection. And he does come back to New York to interact with Rufus's friends post Rufus's death. But I just found that like these introduction of characters kind of drew me out that little bit. And I was like, ooh, I don't know if I would have killed Rufus that early and then had so much of the book exploring the world post Rufus' death. So yeah, I was absolutely loving it in the first third, and as soon as Rufus died, I think I'm not going to say I died, but a part of me kind of died in the story itself, so that I found it really difficult to stay motivated to keep reading, because obviously there's not going to be a miracle and Rufus isn't coming back to life. Now, this isn't to say it gets the book loses its pace or anything like that as the story progresses. I think it actually has a relatively steady pace throughout the entire story, but I think just the death of Rufus sort of killed a bit of that pace for me. Also, the characters are really complex, I'm going to say. They all sort of lack courage in one way or another that becomes, I think for them, life becomes quite frustrating because they all seem to lack this particular bit of courage in a particular part of their lives. And so because of that, they all struggle to grab something that they really love. And because of this, it becomes quite frustrating for them in their lives, which then I think translated to me as the reader, because I started to become a bit frustrated with these characters. And I think it was after the death of Rufus, I really loved Rufus as a character. You know, he's this completely wild, degenerate, struggling artist. And as soon as he dies, I sort of felt like I didn't have a real connection with the other characters. And then I found I didn't really like any of the other characters either. None of them were really certain of themselves, and that just bubbles into this great frustration that flows through the story. And all of them are just really, they're incredibly complex, but they're also just they feel incredibly shallow in other areas. And it's just this lack of courage that I think really drew me out of the story, because I wanted someone to succeed in one way without it having to cost a huge amount, but all of them sort of suffer in many ways, and all of them lack courage in so many ways. And so I just kind of felt a bit drained following them for so long, especially having Rufus's death hanging over us as well. I just felt incredibly drained as the story went on. But then there's so many other things to consider as well. And while I do think this book was incredibly consuming and suffocating, I did read that I believe James Baldwin wrote this book over 17 years, and he actually wrote it in a really difficult time as he was transitioning through his life to a few different places. And he himself was sort of feeling a bit lost in life, and apparently he was suffering from depression, great bouts of depression, and he's sort of struggling with where he lives, and he's moving around constantly. And so you can see the sort of suffocation he might be feeling and the dislocation from life he might have been feeling within himself. And you can see it sort of play out on the page. So even though it's an incredibly difficult and suffocating read, you can really sort of appreciate the fact that it does feel incredibly real in so many aspects. The characters, because they lack this courage and this constitution to seize what it is they love, or even recognize what it is they love, not like, let's remove grabbing it. Let's just like try recognize what it is we love. They all, I'm going to say like incestuously turn to each other. And because they all turn to each other in one way or the other, they all turn on each other in another way. And so this group of friends becomes really entangled. And, you know, Rufus's best friend starts dating Rufus's sister starts dating his best friend, but then starts having an affair with someone else. Vivaldo, who is the best friend, starts an affair with the man. That man, who is Rufus's first male lover, starts an affair with one of Rufus's friends who is married to another of Rufus's friends. So it becomes this really, I mean, even explaining it then, trying to remember all the webs, it becomes this incredibly like interconnected story, and all these webs just get crossed, and it becomes incredibly complex in that way. And it's interesting to really see how the characters do turn to each other in those moments of desperation, but then because of that, they also turn on each other in another way. And I found that really interesting, actually, because it was such a wonderfully played out thing, and it did feel incredibly natural. It didn't feel like it was rushed or anything like that. The only thing that felt really rushed was the ending, I'm going to say. It just sort of peters out a bit, and I sort of got to the end. You know, I'd been listening to this book for, at that stage, like 17 hours, 55 minutes, and then all of a sudden it just kind of ended, and I was like, wait, what? That's the end? And I don't know if he did that on purpose, James Baldwin. I don't know if James Baldwin did that on purpose, because there is no real end to these stories. I mean, we could have easily gone on and on and on, and the hangover of Rufus's death is always going to be there through their lives until, of course, they die themselves. So even as I was listening to it, I didn't know how he was going to resolve it, and I guess, I don't know if he felt that as well and just decided to end it at some point, which, you know, fair enough. If you don't know how to end the story, just end the story. But it just kind of felt a bit rushed for that. There was, I guess, one other criticism that I felt while reading this book was there's a lot of, and this isn't necessarily a bad thing at all, but there was a lot of male suffering in this book, and everything was, I guess, every bit of suffering was a result of male suffering in this book. And a lot of the female characters I felt were not as fleshed out as I would have liked, and they weren't sort of, I guess, given the respect I would have liked. They were either seen as weak or bitches. They just weren't up to the quality that I would have expected from someone like James Baldwin, because he is a fantastic writer, and he does have this really keen attention to detail for individuals, especially existing in really complex societies like this. So it felt like there was a lot of misogyny in this. I know, of course, it was written in a completely different time, so we have to take that into account. But there was a lot of, I mean, I'm trying to now remember, I think every woman at one stage was beaten by their partners in this book. Rufus had started a relationship with the girl, and he'd started beating her up, but then she then gets put into a mental asylum, and there's sort of no respect for her at all, and she's labelled like a bitch for corrupting Rufus at one stage by Rufus's sister, which I also get, because obviously Rufus's sister is gonna take the side of Rufus. But it just felt like the women were really beaten and just labelled bitches, and they were labelled weak. And it just kind of felt a little bit out of place, I guess, for a James Baldwin novel, because so often he is so incredibly good at just performing vivisection on these characters and really giving an accurate portrayal of what life was like. And maybe that's where we come into it, because maybe that was an accurate portrayal of what it was like for women in those periods, and they were sort of silenced and pushed off to the side. And so maybe that's what he was also trying to do in this book, is highlight the fact that women are pushed to this side. But it did feel, I guess, a little bit dated for that. So that's probably my only criticism. My only great criticism of the book is that it did feel quite misogynistic towards women in this story. Nevertheless, it was an incredible story. I probably wouldn't read this one again, just because it did feel a lot longer, and I think that is the audio that's a result of listening to it. It is, I read somewhere that it is one of his longer novels as well, whereas something like Giovanni's Room, I think it's just sort of getting into a really dark story that's 150 pages, penetrating some great depths, and then like coming out and being able to breathe some fresh air is just so wonderful. But this one being upwards of 350 pages is quite long to be in a story like this, where it is really consuming and really dark and touching upon so many big topics. So, I mean, it was an incredible read. I genuinely, definitely recommend it, because it's James Baldwin, and he's an incredible writer. He's easily one of the best, in my opinion, to have ever done it. But yeah, this one for me, probably just a tiny bit too long. And I think it just, it loses a bit of steam for me after Rufus's death, which is the first third. I think you could easily read that first third, and as soon as he dies, almost call it a day there. Maybe go a few more chapters if you want to get sort of the funeral scene and stuff like that. But after that, I think you could easily call it a day on the book, to be quite honest, because that first part of the book is just so incredibly beautiful. It's so raw and real, and just a brutal insight into what life was like. And Rufus is just such a wonderfully, chaotically fun, complex character to spend some time with. So interesting because I loved this book, but I also didn't love this book. I'm kind of torn on a rating. I think I'm going to rate it a 3.5 for this one. Still definitely worth a read, but just a bit too long for me for this particular story. But James Baldwin is the master. Okay, so what was I reading this week? This week, I only spoke about this book last week because I just bought it last week. The Reluctant Fundamentalist by Mohsid Hamin. It is absolutely fantastic. I'm genuinely loving this book. It's incredibly easy to read. 135 pages in of 200. I'm probably going to finish it today. It's about, here, I'll just read the back actually. At a Lahore cafe one evening, you meet a mysterious stranger. He asks you to join him for tea, and speaking impeccable English, he begins to tell you his story. It goes on for a bit, but I'll leave it there, and has adopted this really interesting storytelling, writing style, narration style, because actually I'm not going to go into it yet, but basically it's just this guy telling his life story. I have absolutely no idea where it's going, but each page it sort of starts to feel like it's getting a bit more sinister and a bit more sinister with every page. It's incredibly beautiful. I think the writing style is absolutely fantastic. It's about a Pakistani man living in New York for the most part and his sort of interaction with life. And I think the narration style is really, really fun, but I'm absolutely going to be doing an episode on that. I mean, the fact that I'm smashing through it means I might just do it next week for an episode because why not? So if that's something you're interested in, hang around because it is so good so far. And I'm really, really looking forward to where this is going to end up because apparently it does get quite dark. So stick around for that. If you would like to like and subscribe, I would really appreciate it. You can also head along to the website and support the pod in other ways. You can click the duck in the corner. But as always, just thank you for your attention. So I think it's time to end this episode. And today, to take us away, a quote from Stephen Donaldson from The Wounded Land. And I really like this one. I remember reading it. It was fantastic. There's only one way to hurt a man who's lost everything. Give him back something broken.